Hey everyone, and welcome to Mintcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Mnar Adley, founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. To help us continue these interviews, we invite you to become a member on our Patreon page, which we will link in the video below. As an independent watchdog media outlet that exposes the corruption of the ruling class and the attacks on our civil liberties, we are facing major censorship and shadow banning by social media tech giants. And that's why we ask you to share our videos and our podcast, whether you're listening to it on Spotify or iTunes or on YouTube. Help us fund our projects as we stand up to the war machine. Today, we'll be discussing the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer, which is stepping up its campaign to eradicate socialists, anti-war activists, and anti-imperialists from its ranks. Under Starmer, Labour members of Parliament, including former leader Jeremy Corbyn himself, have been suspended under the guise of a fight against anti-Semitism. But many left-wing or radical Jewish groups have also been targeted. Joining us today to discuss this phenomenon and its connection to the Israeli state is Asa Winstanley. Asa is a London-based investigative journalist who himself was suspended from the Labour Party. You can find his work at the Electronic Intifada and the Middle East Monitor. Asa, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
So there's currently a furious fight for the soul of the British Labour Party as its leadership is expelling a great number of important figures, including Jeremy Corbyn himself. What exactly is going on over there?
Yeah, it's a big question. What is going on? Well, we've got a bit of time. So to go back to the beginning, this really started when Jeremy Corbyn first ran for the leadership of the Labour Party in the summer of 2015, and he was successful and he was elected in September of 2015 as the leader of the Labour Party. You know, many people would argue he was really the first, the most left-wing leader of the Labour Party ever, really. And, you know, it's been many years since the Labour Party has had a genuinely socialist leader. And that what happened was there was a furious campaign against him. There was a furious campaign to stop him, which had successes and failures, but ultimately you can't really argue anything else except that it was successful. You know, Corbyn stepped down. He lost an election and he stepped down as the leadership, as the leader of the Labour Party. And as you mentioned, last year he was suspended as a Labour Party member by the new right-wing leader Keir Starmer, and he was suspended as a member, which meant he couldn't hold any Labour Party office, which meant that he was automatically no longer a Labour MP. But then he appealed, and there was a ruling, and he was allowed back as a member of the Labour Party. So but then what happened was that, and the current situation still is, that Keir Starmer said, all right, although you're a member of the Labour Party, you're not going to be a Labour MP. So he's not a member of the Labour group in Parliament, even though he's a Labour Party member, an ordinary member, supposedly. And he's also still an MP. Because he was elected not by Labour's leadership, but by the British public, by his constituents. So Keir Starmer can't kick him out of Parliament, but he can kick him out of the Labour group in Parliament. So technically, he is an independent MP, although he's devoted his whole life to the Labour Party. So and the elephant in the room here in this discussion is the reasons why he was suspended, and then why he's been essentially purged from the Labour Party in this way. And the reason, the pretext, is supposedly anti-Semitism, is because Jeremy Corbyn questions the narrative of the quote-unquote Labour Party anti-Semitism crisis in a very mild way, I might add, which in my view went nowhere near far enough and was far too timid. But nonetheless, even what he said was too much for the Labour Party leadership. So and this is what it's been all along. What we've had for 6 years is really a witch hunt, and it's been a ferocious campaign against the left in the Labour Party, against the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the Labour Party, against Jeremy Corbyn supporters in the Labour Party, all on the pretext of supposed anti-Semitism, on alleged anti-Semitism, which almost always, 99 times out of 100, at least 99 times out of 100, is just a lie and a pretext, and it is just they're using anti-Semitism as a code word by which they mean support for Palestinian rights. I mean, and this is the thing. This is one of the main reasons Jeremy Corbyn was targeted by who he was targeted by, was the fact that he had a long-term association with the Palestine Solidarity Movement in this country. And this was what was really unacceptable to Labour Party elites, to the British establishment in this country, and to the Israel lobby and the state of Israel itself. And so that's a kind of overall picture of what I've been reporting on for the last 6 years. I mean, there's a lot more to talk about, but
absolutely. And you've done an incredible job covering this for Electronic Intifada. Looking at how anti-Semitism has been, weaponized by the Labour Party through the extension, of course, by the Israel lobby through the extension of the Labour Party. So talk to me a little bit more about how the Israel lobby has influenced the Labour Party to do this and to purge people like Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. So there's been so many different ways that they've done it. So again, to step back with a little bit of historical context, the Labour Party in many ways has always been an imperialist party, and it really, I mean, it's an old party, it's more than 100 years old. Lenin used to write about the Labour Party and how treacherous it was and how it intended to dupe the working class movement. If you look at it historically, the Labour Party, not in terms of its rank and file, not in terms of its membership, but in terms of its leadership, in terms of its MPs, and in terms of its ministers when it's been in government, its prime ministers, has absolutely been an imperialist party. On the other hand, in domestic ways, it has done positive things at certain times in its history, most famously, of course, after 1945, the foundation of the National Health Service, which is still just about going today. Although, there's been best efforts to kind of dismantle it by stealth that are still ongoing. So it has had a positive domestic role of reinforcing, of building up some kind of welfare state for the people of Britain. But in terms of its role overseas, it has been, almost intractably imperialist, and no more so, and especially in the case of Palestine, going even back to before the foundation of the State of Israel, or upon the mass graves of Palestinians in 1948. The Labour Party's policy was, the policy of Labour Party elites, of Labour Party higher-ups who would go on to become ministers in the Labour government of 1945, was described by one historian that I read as Zionism plus plus. There were some figures that were even more Zionist than the Zionist movement themselves. So, for example, there was Hugh Dalton, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister in the 1945 Labour government. He was fanatically pro-Zionist, and he was also anti-Semitic as well. He was anti-Jewish. He did have these very prejudiced attitudes against British Jews. And his attitude seemed to be, well, let's get rid of the Jews and send them to Palestine. What he wanted to see was an even larger Jewish state than was being proposed by the Zionist movement at the time. That it would even have, expand into Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and even as far as Libya in some versions of his crackpot scheme. So, there was this long, and it goes on through, in the 1960s, Harold Wilson, Labour Party Prime Minister in the 60s, who, is part of the soft left of the party, And again, domestically, he did actually have some pretty left-wing policies domestically. But in the international realm, he was incredibly imperialist. Like, he wanted to support the Americans in the Vietnam War, but was prevented from doing so really by domestic popular pressure. But he was incredibly pro-Israel. He was a member of Labour Friends of Israel. He wrote a whole book about Israel, about how much he loved it and so forth. And so on and so forth, all the way down through to Tony Blair. So the popularity of Israel and Zionism in the Labour Party really ebbed over the years. It really began to wane. But in the mid-90s, with the rise of Tony Blair and the whole neoliberal reformation of the Labour Party under so-called New Labour, and the Tony Blair government starting in 1997, the Labour Party became what the Labour Friends of Israel boasted was, quote, a safe home for Zionism. Actually, I'm paraphrasing there. I don't believe that's the exact quote, but something along those lines. You know, they were boasting about how it was a given that Blair would come to Labour Friends of Israel meetings and so forth. So all this is to say that with Jeremy Corbyn, with the election, by the popular will of Labour Party members in 2015, of Jeremy Corbyn as leader, there was a decisive break in history. And Palestine became really the emblematic issue, because Corbyn represented the prospect for change, that there would be a sharp reversal of the New Labour years, that they would reverse the stealth privatisation of the NHS, that they would begin to start talking about popular policies like nationalisation of the train, renationalisations of the trains to reverse the damage that was done by Margaret Thatcher and all these industries and so forth. And what was genuinely new with Corbyn was that he did have anti-imperialist politics, that he had, and that he was part of the Palestine solidarity movement. And so Palestine became an issue emblematic in the Labour Party, greater even than Palestine itself. It became this really totemic issue. And this was really what inspired his enemies to attack him. And so what we saw with his enemies was really, it was a nexus of powerful interests. So really, he had the entire British establishment against him. Yeah. You know, ranging from all the political parties, including his own party, including the leaders of his own party, including the bureaucracy of his own party, including 3/4 of the MPs, at least, of his own party. The membership were with him, but the membership had, you know, limited ability to influence things at the top. And, you know, obviously the Tory party were against him. The Liberal Democrats were against him. The British press was overwhelmingly hostile, almost entirely hostile. You know, there's been some quite good studies done of that by the Media Reform Coalition, which showed just how hostile the newspapers were and the press, incredibly biased against him. And the British deep state was against him as well. And they were quite relatively open about it. So the security apparatus, the permanent security apparatus that rules this country in, you know, quite similar fashions to other countries like the US, the military intelligence nexus, you know, the civil servants in Whitehall, the spooks of MI5 and MI6 and so forth, were opposed to him. And, you know, they made some quite open disclosures about this. You know, that at some points there was headlines in the Times, in the Sunday Times, about how if Corbyn became prime minister, there would be, quote unquote, a mutiny in the army, and all these kind of threats. You know, before the election of 2019, Corbyn was summoned by the leaders of MI5, by senior MI5 officers, for a quote unquote facts of life discussion about, you know, how far, just in case he, you know, a disaster happened and he became prime minister, you know, they were trying to, I suppose, we don't know exactly what was discussed, but I would suppose they were talking about the red lines that he couldn't cross. So, you know, with all these kind of huge forces against him,
Right.
It was actually, I mean, to give him his dues, he did achieve quite a lot considering what was ranged against him. And all this is quite well known and quite accepted by the British left in its defeat at the moment, in its current defeat. But what still isn't being widely accepted, or at least not openly talking about, is that part of this oppositional nexus against Corbyn, and in my view, the key part, and in my view, the vanguard, was the state of Israel, was the state of Israel's intelligence services, was the state of Israel's associated lobby, and it's basically its influence operation in Britain. So, I've come around to actually start to answer the question you actually asked, which is how did Israel influence?
Well, I think it's important to understand the background so that we can understand where we are today. So how is Israel directly influencing the Labour Party?
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite similar in some ways to what happens in the US. So we have the Israel lobby in this country, and we have some quite similar organizations. So instead of AIPAC, the main organs of political influence of the Israel lobby in this country, we don't have a direct equivalent to AIPAC. We've got one or two organizations which there's one called BICOM, which is probably the closest equivalent, the Britain Israel Communications and Research Center, possibly the closest equivalent of AIPAC, but it's nowhere near as big or as well funded. Although it does have substantial funding from Purged Zablovovich, the scion of an Israeli arms dealer. But yeah, it's not as big. But the main political influence of the Israel lobby is what are called Friends of Israel groups. So each political party has a Friends of Israel, an organization called Friends of Israel. So there's a conservative Friends of Israel, which has as members Tory MPs and lords and other political figures. And, it has quite a substantial membership. It has a lot of influential figures. It's got some very rich people, British Zionists mainly, funding it. And at one stage, I don't know if this is still true, but about a decade ago, it claimed to have 80% of Tory Conservative Party MPs as its members. And secondly, there is Labour Friends of Israel, which played a key role in trying to really sabotage the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And there are other smaller Friends of Israel groups for the other smaller political parties. But these are really the main two. And so the Israel lobby's got all this nexus of groups, of different groups. There's so many different ones, and if we think of the Al Jazeera's documentary from 2017, The Lobby, which was, an undercover investigation of Britain's Israel lobby, they really got into a lot of these different groups, and they played different roles, and they're a mixture of volunteer pro-Israel activists and professional Israel lobbyists, and it's in that respect is quite similar to the Israel lobby in the US. It influences politicians. They fund politicians. They give donations to MPs, prospective leaders in the different parties. And what made their role quite pernicious within the Labour Party against Jeremy Corbyn was that they had organisations within the Labour Party who were really had infiltrated the Labour Party to influence the course of events in favour of the foreign policy, in favour of the policies of a hostile foreign power, which is Israel. Israel would, of course, argue that it's an ally to Britain. And it depends on your definitions. If we talk about British elites, then perhaps they would have more of an argument there. But I would argue that's still not necessarily the case. And we saw some of that in the Al Jazeera undercover documentary, where this Israeli embassy agent Shai Massot was caught, trying to undermine Tory party ministers. So within inside the Labour Party, we had two main groups, two main Israel lobby groups: Labour Friends of Israel and the Jewish Labour Movement. And their main tactic and strategy of getting rid of Corbyn was essentially to either directly or indirectly accuse him of anti-Semitism, or to try and associate him and smear him with anti-Semitism in some way by saying, oh, he's not doing enough. If it wasn't convincing that he's, their argument that he's anti-Semitic wasn't being bought by, it certainly wasn't being bought by Labour Party members. They tried to say that he wasn't doing enough to stop his followers being anti-Semitic, or they went for his closest supporters, and they were quite successful in that regard, and there was kind of a whole series of moral panics about it. There was a lot of, for want of a better word, hysteria within the British mainstream press. I mean, there's a lot written rightly about the American corporate press and how bad it is and how propagandistic it is and so forth. But they really have nothing on the British press. Like the British. I mean, if you see the British corporate media in full flow, it's just a pure torrent of lies. And what they did to Corbyn was really black is white territory. Where they tried to say that one of Britain's leading anti-racist activists had suddenly overnight become its leading racist, its leading anti-Semite, and the campaign was successful. It wasn't successful in terms of convincing people, convincing the masses. So if you look at polling, for example, of Labour Party membership, and the Labour Party, remember, at its height under Jeremy Corbyn, had as many as 600,000 members. It was record numbers, record membership. It was the largest, at one point, it was the largest political party in Western Europe. It would be, and this membership had come about because of Corbyn, because people were joining the party as a way to support him and as a way to vote for him. Because there was that you could just join the party at the beginning. They tightened up the rules later, but at the beginning you could just join as what was called a supporting member. You could just pay £3 and you would have a vote in the leadership election. And so people were joining that just to vote for him, and it led to this mass political party. And still now there's supposed to be about 500,000 members still, but that we haven't seen any figures reported for a while, and that must be ebbing away now with all the purges going on. But if you look at polling all along, and this is something I've followed through the years, consistently the membership did not believe the anti-Semitism story. Consistently, it showed that big majorities of the membership thought that the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party existed, but had been exaggerated. Right. So even after Corbyn was defeated in the 2019 election, those figures had actually gone up. The polling showed that 3/4 of Labour members, almost 75% of Labour members, believed that, I forget the exact wording, but believed that the issue of Labour Party anti-Semitism had been invented or exaggerated for political reasons to attack Corbyn. And if you looked at Momentum members, which was a campaign group to support Corbyn, it was as much as 90%. So, the campaign from that perspective, the Israel Lobby campaign to smear Corbyn from that perspective was not successful. But what it was successful in doing was to raise doubt in enough people's minds where there was divisions caused on the left. And what that meant was Corbyn's supporters who were attacked as anti-Semitic were thrown under the bus. So you had people like Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, the British left's most, in the opinion of one leading conservative columnist, he wrote that Ken Livingstone was Britain's most successful left-wing politician of all time because he had managed to be the first mayor of London in 2000, the first directly elected mayor of London, who had real political powers, and he had a big budget, and he He carried out policies such as the congestion zone, the congestion charge zone to reduce pollution in the city centre and reduce cars. Ken Livingstone had, he had real political power, and he was one of the very few Labour Party figures with a national profile in the mainstream corporate media who was actually supportive of Corbyn. So all the other high profile Labour Party figures with clout in the party were completely against Corbyn. There was very few high profile people with mainstream media access who supported him. And Ken Livingstone was one of those people you could count on one hand. And they basically politically assassinated him and smeared him as an anti-Semite. And it was very sad what was done to him. He was smeared. And he was then kind of thrown under the bus, really, by Corbyn, really. I mean, you have to say it at this stage, and by the people around him. They didn't stand by him. And there was a whole series of people like that then, of his high-profile supporters, activists, the MP Chris Williamson, anti-racist activists like Jackie Walker and Mark Wadsworth, who had positions that were either actively anti-Zionist or even just mildly critical of Israel and supportive of Corbyn. They were thrown under the bus one by one. So it led to this series of demoralization and defeat within the movement. So there was the movement behind Corbyn was the reason that he got to the position that he did. And once that was divided, really, there was nothing to stop his defeat ultimately.
It's pretty incredible how the anti-Semitism card has been weaponized to target these anti-imperialist leaders. I mean, if we look at what's happening here in the United States, we've seen figures like Ilhan Omar completely, just dealt a major character assassination, which even led to her changing some of her positions in terms of supporting Israel and Palestine. I mean, she wrote this op-ed. She went from being a staunch BDS supporter, calling out the Israel lobby and so forth, to writing an op-ed calling for a two-state solution, which is obviously like a J Street, theatrical dream, right? A two-state solution would just continue to give Zionists more opportunity to steal more Palestinian land.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting just to see the comparisons of what's happening here in the United States and what's happening in the UK. But it is interesting because it does show the power of the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement that Jeremy Corbyn was able to bring to the party. It was clearly successful. It was clearly, worrying to the British elite. So who are some others who have been purged? I think, you and I have talked about like Ken Loach, for example. He's a famous film director. Talk to us about his story.
Yeah, I mean, that continues on nicely for what I was just saying about these series of people who were basically kicked out of the party, disciplined, suspended, expelled in different ways. And that really has never stopped, despite Corbyn being kicked out of the party and kicked out as a Labour MP last year. That just keeps going on. When Keir Starmer came to power last year as the replacement for Jeremy Corbyn, he really signalled on quite early that he was going to turn the party back towards its, Zionist past, its pro-Israel past. And what was revealed almost immediately after he was elected, he didn't disclose it before the election, was that he had actually been funded by Israel lobbyist Trevor Chin, who's this one of the most prominent backers of the Israel lobby in the UK, funder of Labour Friends of Israel and lots of different other groups, lots of different other pro-Israel groups, Israel lobby groups, Zionist groups, this nexus of organizations, which is really coordinated by the State of Israel itself and, its governmental bodies and really by its intelligence organizations, I would argue. Keir Starmer began to turn Labour back towards Zionism, back towards Israel. And what that meant, there was a series of people who I mean, the expulsions and the discipline and the suspensions and all that kind of stuff never really ended. Unfortunately, for whatever reasons, Jeremy Corbyn too, in a similar way to Ilhan Omar, he began to buckle. He began to he never had full control, and he never seemed to have the political will to assert full control of the Labour Party apparatus, of the bureaucrats. They began, who were expelling people all over the place. He could have spoken up in favor of people like Jackie Walker, in favor of people like Ken Livingstone, in favor of people like Mark Wadsworth, but he didn't. At best he was silent, and at worst, in the case of Ken Livingstone, he actually added his voice towards the political assassination of Ken Livingstone, really, in my view. So this has just continued on. So there's been other people last year, like David Miller, who was suspended, but then ultimately quit from the Labour Party before he could be expelled. David Miller is...
he's the professor, right?
Yeah, professor at Bristol University, who's really been one of the most incisive critics of the Israel lobby. And he's an academic specialist in propaganda and lobbying. So he hasn't only written about the Israel lobby, but when he came to his researches on the Israel lobby, he found the most ferocious defamation campaign against him and his work. But he's been working on the topic for really it was about a decade ago I first met him. And he's done some really brilliant research, which is never debunked, it's never disproved, it's always bulletproof. I mean, I've always found it to be incredibly useful and helpful. But there's been a real defamation campaign against him. He was suspended from the party. There was others, and I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, there some of a disproportionately high number of the victims of this witch hunt and this purge, targeting Palestine solidarity activists, have actually been Jewish themselves. Jewish anti-Zionists or Jewish non-Zionists, people from the group Jewish Voice for Labour, which was set up in the Corbyn years to really kind of support Corbyn from a left-wing Jewish perspective. And they're being kicked out of the party now. People like Naomi Wimborne-Madrisi have been suspended. There's been threats to expel Graham Bash, who is actually the partner of Jackie Walker, who's a left-wing Jewish member of the Labour Party, been a member for decades, who's tried to campaign to push the Labour Party left, even in its darkest hours. And now he's being threatened to be expelled from the party on the most ridiculous, of pretexts. And yes, as you mentioned, so the most high-profile recent victim of this purge campaign has been Ken Loach, the British director who has a long history of. I think he's in his early 80s now. Ken Loach, he's done decades of work. Making some really brilliant films which have working class themes, anti-imperialist themes. He did a really good film in, I think it was 2015, called The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which was about the Irish freedom struggle, basically, when the IRA, the original IRA, rose up to liberate Ireland from British occupation, and then the subsequent civil war in Ireland over that, which led ultimately some decades later to the Troubles. Really good film. And Land and Freedom, a film about the Spanish Civil War and the struggle against fascism in Spain. More recent films like Daniel Blake, about a working class man who's suffering under the oppressions of trying to work under benefits, of trying to find work and of trying to survive despite the austerity in this country. So he's a man who uses his talent and his stature and his privilege and his career in the world's cinema scene to really advance popular causes and anti-imperialist causes, left-wing causes. And of course, one of those has always been the support for the Palestinian cause and support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. and he's been really smeared, and he has now been expelled from the Labour Party. And the reason apparently given for his quote unquote auto exclusion, as party bureaucrats put it in their jargon, was that he refused to disavow others who were said to be, verboten in some kind of way. So, and this, it seems to have been Labour Against the Witch Hunt, which is a small activist group, a campaign group, which has been one of the few voices really to organise a campaign against this witch hunt and this purge, which has been going on for years now. So it's really become a kind of McCarthyist thing where you have, and a lot of people have compared it to the Salem witch trials, where in order to save yourself, you had to denounce someone else. And we've seen that sadly on the left, on the so-called left in this country, especially people who've got mainstream media profiles who consider themselves leftists, who were the first to throw people like Ken Livingstone and Chris Williamson under the bus and say, well, I'm a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, but this person's gone too far and they're anti-Semitic, in the hope that they'll be spared from this purge. And I've been saying all along, and many people have been saying all along, they'll come for you in the end. And that's what's happening now. We're seeing it now. And, to be honest, I've got very little sympathy for some of the people who are kind of seeing the light now, although they're not seeing the light really. They're not admitting that they did anything wrong. They're just sort of all of a sudden surprised that there's the threat to expel people from the Labour Party, as if this hasn't been going on for years. So, it's a really kind of a sad situation we found ourselves in. I mean, I think my opinion, unfortunately to say, is that the British left has been defeated for a generation, and it doesn't even realize it's defeated. This is the thing. Like they sort of think everything's okay, that there was a setback in 2019 with Jeremy Corbyn, and that, we can come back.
Well, I think we saw a similar phenomenon take place here in the United States with, the Democratic Party and the rise of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
I definitely would not compare Jeremy Corbyn to Bernie Sanders.
No, but it's very similar. You're right. No, I mean, they have different politics in a lot of ways, but you're right. It's very similar dynamics going on in terms of the movement. I agree with you.
Well, and not Jeremy Corbyn, but Bernie Sanders was used, I believe, to divide the left. And I think that we're seeing the results of that today, because the left today in the United States, very similar to how you described the left in the UK, it's basically been hijacked by the neoliberal establishment to support war. So I really appreciate you talking with us, because you have firsthand experience with the Labour Party. I mean, you were literally an insider. You were a member of the Labour Party, and talk to me about your experience and how you got out. Were you purged or did you leave?
How I escaped the Labour Party. Well, I don't want to exaggerate my experience, because there's been people who, like I mentioned, like Graham Bash, who have genuinely been in the Labour Party despite their disagreement with the leadership. Graham's a friend of mine. I think he's an older gentleman. I think he's in his late 60s, early 70s. I'm not sure. Sorry if you're younger than that, Graham. And he's been in the Labour Party for decades, ploughing away and trying to hope against hope to turn the Labour Party left. And he's being expelled and sort of burned as some kind of witch, and being accused indirectly of being anti-Semitic, which is disgusting when you think about, the persecution of there has been persecution of Jewish people. And the irony is now that the Labour Party is more often than not is actually persecuting left-wing pro-Palestinian Jews in the Labour Party, precisely because they are left-wing pro-Palestinian Jews in the Labour Party. And it is really disgusting to see. But yes, I joined the Labour Party in 2016, really because I saw, just as a way to support Corbyn. Like I was never invested in the Labour Party. I never really had faith in the Labour Party. I knew that I would be purged at some point, but I still thought it was worth trying to resist what was being done, because at the time when I joined, there was a coup, an attempted coup taking place by Labour Party MPs against Corbyn's leadership, and they were trying to kick him out by the back door and to ignore the members' vote. And so I joined just as a way to kind of try and resist that. I mean, I was never really particularly active as a Labour Party member. I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, and that's what I do. And I was going to write about the Labour Party and I was going to write about the Labour Party purge, regardless of whether I was inside the party or not. But yeah, I joined. I went to a few party meetings. I did campaign in the 2017 election a little bit. I delivered some leaflets. I met lots of good people in the grassroots in the Labour Party, which I'd been doing anyway. As the reporting, I'd been talking as I went along reporting on the story. I'd met these people and talked to them, and some people were saying join, and we need people like you to kind of struggle and what's happening. So I was kind of beguiled by that, and I joined up. And then a few years later, I was suspended. And I went through a process of appeal where I was kind of refuting the allegations against me that I was anti-Semitic and so forth. I've written about it, and my colleague Ali Aronima has written about it in some detail. And people can look up all the back and forth of what was alleged, the ridiculous allegations against me and so forth. You can see all the details. And
I think all of us have dealt these kind of anti-Semitic blows. Yeah. In some way, shape, or form, working within independent media, working, to push progressive policies like what you've done yourself within the Labour Party. I think it's a very common theme that we've been systemically targeted.
Yeah, definitely. But to answer your question, in the end, I did jump before I could be pushed. So I did quit. I was suspended, which means you're suspended pending investigation, which could ultimately result in your expulsion. I went through some of the process, but then when Keir Starmer came in, they basically reiterated the process against me, and they kind of ignored all the evidence that I'd sent them refuting the initial evidence, their initial accusations. They kind of ignored all that. So I could see, I consulted a lawyer, and the advice was that it would probably be better for me to resign in protest rather than have them kick me out, because it was very clear there was going to be no. It was a foregone conclusion. They decided on a course of action, which was to get rid of me, to make an example of me, as they'd done with lots of other people, and that I was not going to receive any kind of fair hearing, and that the party was really institutionally anti-Palestinian. That
I was just about to say that it's institutionally anti-Palestinians at this point. So is there any way for this to turn around?
Well, that's the question on a lot of people's lips. And personally, I don't see it. No, I don't see it happening. I really don't see it happening. I think the Labour Party is reverting to type. I could be wrong. There's lots of people who are still remaining in the Labour Party and are kind of trying to struggle against what's happening. But I think to go back to an earlier point that I made about the defeat of the British left, I don't think there can be any real hope of defeating this current in the Labour Party unless there's a real diagnosis of what actually happened. And that would require to understand some of the things we've been talking about, and to understand the fact that the organs of a hostile foreign power, namely the state of Israel, will be mobilized against any left-wing current or any current in this country, any political current in this country, which Israel views to be against its interests. Israel is known for influencing, and it has a very well proven and quite open record of trying to influence elections and the political process in Britain and the US in its favor, and it doesn't always win. It doesn't always get its way. It's by no means all powerful, certainly not. But at the same time, we've got to have a realistic appraisal of the situation. And the fact is, the state of Israel and its intelligence organizations were involved in a sabotage campaign against a popular left-wing leader in this country in a successful mission to stop him entering number 10 Downing Street. And, the results speak for themselves. He was really overthrown in a coup, ultimately in a long coup against his leadership, in my view. And the state of Israel was involved in that. It played a leading role in the sabotage campaign against him. Israel's proxies in this country played a leading role in the destruction of Jeremy Corbyn They were successful enough to raise enough doubts about him being an anti-Semite and being this sort of quote unquote extremist that it was enough to stop him entering Downing Street, in my view.
So let's talk about this new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who is basically leading this, McCarthyist-style campaign to purge socialist, anti-war, anti-imperialist, pro-Palestine members of the Labour Party. You mentioned that it was not really disclosed during the elections that he was actively being funded by the Israel lobby in the UK. Let's talk about his connections to the Israel lobby, and if you will, explain to us how much funding, if you're aware of how much funding he is receiving, and his ties to the British deep state, because it sounds like he is trying to bring back this neoliberal agenda to the Labour Party that for the past decade or so was kind of going to the left, but now he's kind of bringing it right back to the right.
Yeah. So I wrote an article at the time which detailed the exact funding, and he received this funding. And there was several other people who were involved within the Labour Party who were involved in the sabotage campaign against Corbyn, who received funding from the Israel lobby. So, for example, there was a breakaway group of Labour and Conservative MPs, mostly Labour MPs, who in 2019 they formed a breakaway party, which was completely irrelevant and completely failed in its attempt to win any seats in Parliament. But it was successful, and another successful negative headline against Corbyn. The majority of those MPs were members of Labour Friends of Israel, and several of them had received funding from Israel lobby funders and financiers. Labour's deputy leader in the Corbyn years was, a real right winger, pro New Labour figure, who was also receiving funding from the Israel lobby. His office was receiving funding from the Israel lobby. And these people were basically, I don't know whether it's kind of irrelevant to me whether they believe in what they were doing or they just cared about the money. It doesn't matter. The results were the same. Keir Starmer, when he was campaigning to be the leader of the Labour Party, declared that they had what's called a hustings, where they had the different candidates for leader all sort of lined up and questioned on their positions on certain things, and they all turned up to the Israel lobby's hustings, which was organized by Labour Friends of Israel and the Jewish Labour movement, and they one of the questions was, are you a Zionist? And they all said they were Zionists, except for Keir Starmer, who quibbled and said, I'm a supporter of Zionism.
Wow.
So he said, I'm a supporter. It was even worse what he said, really, in the way he said, I'm a supporter of Zionism without qualification. That was what he clarified to the press later, because, it was when he said he quibbled that he was a supporter of Zionism. It was seen as like insufficiently supportive because he hadn't said
that's not enough.
Yeah. Because he hadn't explicitly said I'm a Zionist like the others had. They were all kind of trying to make them parrot these ridiculous platitudes, which I don't think most of them even understood what they were saying. And not to excuse it, that just makes it worse, really, in a way. But he declared that he's a supporter of Zionism without qualification, and and since then the party has turned in that way. And yeah, like you said, Starmer is really a pillar of the British establishment. He was the former director of public prosecutions, I guess equivalent of Attorney General, right, in the US. He's the person who decides on behalf of the government who's going to be prosecuted and who isn't. And it was I haven't done as much research into this area, but I believe it was him who made the decision or he was certainly involved in making the decision to prosecute Julian Assange. He's essentially a big part of the British establishment, and he has managed to get to the top of the Labour Party, and which isn't all that unusual, really, when you look at the Labour Party's terrible leaders that it's had over the years. And it's really Corbyn who was kind of a break with that, that there was really and which is why we saw a real freak out in this country over the last several years by the political media establishment, was that it was different. There was some kind of hope for genuine change, which, I don't think we see anymore now.
And, here in the United States, we have alternatives to like the Democratic Party, like the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, which are oftentimes not even given a voice during third party or during the debates in terms of the elections. What alternatives do the British have today? Is Labour Party the alternative, or are there others, and are they even given a platform?
The Labour Party is really the main party, the main opposition party. The Labour Party is really, in large part, it's part of the British establishment, which is why it was so ranged against Corbyn. But there's always been this kind of wing of the Labour Party, this left wing of the Labour Party, which was, even during the Blair years, it was kept inside the tent, quote unquote, because the idea was that it's better to have your enemies closer, I suppose, kind of thing. And if they're at least involved in the party, you can kind of neuter them and keep a lid on it. And what happened with Corbyn was not supposed to be the expected result. But yeah, we do have a Green Party as well, which has got one MP in Parliament and other MPs in various places in local government. And aside from that, there are the nationalist parties, the Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, and the Scottish National Party, and the various parties in the north of Ireland. We do election times, and there's the right wing part, the former UK Independence Party, which campaigned for the UK to leave the EU, which was successful in a lot of ways because of Brexit, I suppose. And these smaller parties do tend to get a role in the TV debates, some of them anyway, during elections. So in terms of smaller left-wing parties, there are lots of them. The British left is sort of notoriously fractious, which again was one of the big changes from the Corbyn years, where the entire British left seemed to unite on this one issue of trying to get Corbyn elected as the Labour Party leader, because they thought it'd be worth a shot and it'd be something, new and different. But the British left has kind of reverted to type now and is kind of all divided against itself once again. There are some efforts to set up alternative parties, but none of them really have made any kind of reached any kind of tipping point or critical mass or anything like enough unity that there could be a genuine alternative there. Again, I could be wrong, but I just don't see it happening at the moment. The issues that led to the rise of Corbyn and the mass movement that was behind him are all still there. People don't want the NHS to be privatised. People are concerned about climate change. People don't want to have endless foreign wars. people don't want there to be unlimited support for Israel. There's all these popular issues which are not being served by the main two political parties. So, I mean, I think until they are, there will be some kind of, you can never rule out, although I'm very pessimistic right now, but you can never rule out that there'll be a new movement for something, a new powerful political movement that could bring some kind of change.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, London this year saw the largest protests in terms of support for Palestinian human rights when Israel was bombarding Gaza, raining bombs on Gaza, committing a major massacre against the Gaza Strip. And so clearly, the England represents a huge swath of support for Palestinian human rights. And so the fact that this McCarthyist style campaign has been taking place against these pro-Palestine, MPs and members like yourself and Ken Loach and Jeremy Corbyn and others is just to show that the pro-Palestinian movement is working. It is working and it is successful and it is so strong. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking such a staunchly, McCarthyist stance against these activists.
Yeah, and I think as well, something that is quite relatively new that we've started to see, especially in the last year or so, with the Black Lives Matter movement and with popular reassessment, especially by young people in this country, of the role of the British Empire and of issues like slavery and of current day issues like institutional racism against Black people. 22 years ago, there was a report by a retired judge which declared that the British police was institutionally racist over the way that it had failed to investigate the murder by white racists, by white supremacists of the Black teenager Stephen Lawrence, and they'd essentially covered it up. 22 years later, very little has actually changed. They're just a bit better about hiding it. The British police still are overwhelmingly, stopping and searching Black people, still pulling over young Black men. And, and that's why when we had the uprising, the Black Lives Matter uprising last year, it really spread to this country and France for the reasons and it wasn't just, it gets criticized sometimes for, you're just adopting the American, you're just trying to look good and sort of be woke and all this kind of stuff. But no, I don't think it was that at all. I think it was because of the history of British imperialism and French imperialism, we have a lot of the same problems, although in terms of institutional racism, that are in America. And the younger generation was starting, and it is starting to wake up and see that actually the British Empire, it wasn't this great thing, that it was something that, institutionalized slavery. It was, and that later on that, killed millions of people the world over in order to enforce the most bloody global empire the world has ever seen. It had mass atrocities against people in Kenya. All sorts of crimes the British Empire was involved in. And this wider understanding of the role of British Empire in the world has led to a reassessment of the Palestinian cause, that it's not this one-off thing, that actually it was in that context, and that actually, in the same way that Britain tried to colonize the world and tried to control the world, they tried to do the same thing in Palestine. And they saw the Zionist movement as their most reliable way to do that, and later on, of course, had a falling out with Zionism, but ultimately it handed Palestine over to the Zionist movement, and that's where Israel came from. And so I think that we are starting to see that wider kind of understanding and putting the Palestinian struggle in that more global context, which has led to this increase in popular support for the demonstrations that we saw earlier this year that you mentioned.
Well, and England is home to Palestine Solidarity Movement. The Palestine Action activist group as well. And so I think that's really truly representative of how active the British are in terms of resisting, UK support of, Israeli apartheid. So, Asa, it was so good to speak with you today. You are just a wealth of information in terms of what's going on within the Labour Party, the targeting and attacks against leftist and pro-Palestine movement. For those who are watching and listening, please follow Asa Winstanley on Electronic Intifada. And we'll link to some of his articles in the video and also in the article post that will accompany this podcast. Thank you so much, Asa.
Thanks for having me.